Okay, so just my credentials right here, and Marla already went through that, so I'll just go ahead to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the neurobiology of the brain, and this is something that really helps us to understand addiction. We're at a point now where I think if we really look at it the right way, and if we have somebody to sort of guide us in that knowledge, then it really will help us to have a better understanding of addiction, and also in treatment and how that works, why certain things make sense, why certain things may not make sense or may not work as well. And so you can just see here's some pictures of nerves. You've got a schematic right over here of a nerve cell or a neuron. Those two terms are synonymous. And over here is a dendrite. I don't know if, do we want to turn off any of the lights here to see if we can see this a little bit better? Does that help at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is where the signal is picked up, and then it travels along the long part of the nerve, which is the axon, and then it gets to the axon terminal over here, which is where your neurotransmitters are released, and that's where really the stuff happens. We have an understanding of that. We have some understanding of how addiction works. You have a couple of pictures of neurons right over here. You can see over here on the bottom two neurons connecting with each other. And there's a few connections there, and then you see over here a Purkinje cell in the brain, and if you saw that in 3D, you'd actually see how really complex that is. And so that's got over 100,000 connections to other nerve cells. So you have this variation. You have over 100 billion nerve cells or neurons in the brain. You have over 500 trillion connections. It's plastic. It's changing all the time. It's dynamic. And to maybe give you a better idea over here. I'm gonna go to that. Didn't do this in rehearsal. So again, here's a neuron, and these 3D apps I think make it a little bit more interesting and also help improve our understanding of things. And so this is where the signals are picked up. These are called the dendrites over here, and then the long part of the nerve that you see is called the axon. You see over in the center, you see the nucleus, the orange right there. That's where the neurotransmitters are produced. And then once the signal gets to the end over here, then it gets to this part of the neuron, which is the terminal boutons. And that's where you have all the neurotransmitters, and that's where those are released. So, and then here's something else just to help you. You can see these little, these are like little cellophane packets over here, and that's what those contain the neurotransmitter. The signal travels along the nerve. Once it gets to the end of the nerve cell, then these little packets containing the neurotransmitters will migrate to the end of this. They'll fuse with this membrane, release all the neurotransmitter into that space, and then they'll fuse with the receptors on the other side. And once that happens, that allows that signal to continue again. So that's just some things about basic neurotransmission. Now the significance of this is that these neurotransmitters have different actions and influence our behavior. And it's the neurotransmitters that really help lead us to an understanding of what it is that's going on with addiction. There's a lot of different neurotransmitters. There's over 100 different neurotransmitters that we know of so far. There's probably a lot more. But dopamine is the one that you've probably heard of the most, and for a good reason. And I'll explain why that is. But dopamine, it has different actions actually, depending on where it is in the brain or in the body. But in the part of the brain that we're going to be talking about, which is in the reward pathway, the nucleus accumbens, it gives us that feeling of euphoria. So it's the beginning of the reward pathway, and it gives us that reward. So we really owe a big debt of gratitude to these guys, James Olds and Peter Milner. And I think everybody in this field should know these two names, because these guys really were the first guys to really give us an understanding, or at least give us evidence of an understanding of how addiction works in the brain. People had theories, but we didn't really have any good hard evidence as to what was really going on. And the interesting thing is that these guys weren't even looking at all for addiction. They were doing studies on mice. They had implanted electrodes, or in rats, they implanted an electrical device where they could stimulate a part of the brain, and they were looking to see if they stimulated a part of the brain, if we would influence what a mouse would do in a maze, whether it would turn to the right or turn to the left. And in one of these animals, they missed their target. And the behavior that they noted in the animal was very interesting. It seemed to them like the animal really liked the stimulation that it was getting. So they went ahead and they set up a Skinner box, whereby the animal could press a lever and therefore give itself the stimulation. So what do you think happened when they did that?
You kept pressing that picture.
Yeah, it would press this lever. It would press this lever over and over again. It would press it up to 5,000 times in an hour. And in fact, it would do nothing but press this lever. And if they gave it a lever for, and then later on they did things where they would give it a lever for food and water, and then a lever to stimulate this part of its brain, and would just completely ignore the food and water, and would starve to death. And then later people actually did things where it would have to stand on a grate with an electrical current going through it, so that it was actually being electrocuted to death. And it would go ahead and it would tolerate being electrocuted to death in order to press this lever and to continue stimulating this part of its brain. Now later on, people did studies and found that got the same results in animals that had some predisposition, at least, to drugs. They could do it. They could do it in a mouse. They could do it. They could do it in a monkey. They could do it in a dog. They could do it in any animal, and they always got the same results. So what they found, this area of the brain that they were stimulating, they later found out, they later called it the nucleus accumbens. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But what that area of the brain does is when it's stimulated, it releases dopamine. And then that goes through the reward pathway. Right. So usually stimulation to that area is going to result in, and you look in that area of the brain, you have neurons with those packets, the vesicles, and they're full of dopamine. And you stimulate that, and you get this release of large amounts of dopamine. And later people found other areas in the brain too, where an animal would exhibit the same kind of behavior. In other words, if you were stimulating that part of the brain, an animal would continue to press a lever, and it would do that to the exclusion of everything else, including basic survival skills or needs. But what they found out was that all of these areas, they always were connected to the nucleus accumbens. They always had that long part of the nerve that we saw before, the axon. The axons always fed into the nucleus accumbens. And so you got the same end result where you got the release of dopamine from the nucleus accumbens. So right over here we can see, I don't know how well you can see it here, I'm going to show you this on something else, but the nucleus accumbens, that gives you an idea of where it is in the brain. I'm going to show you something else that's going to give you a better idea. The VTA right over there, that stands for the ventral tegmental area, and that's one of those areas that feeds directly into the nucleus accumbens and stimulates it to release dopamine. And that's often where this whole process starts. That's often the beginning of the reward pathway. And so those are two areas that are really important to know for addiction, because this is where the reward pathway starts off, and this is where the dopamine ends up getting released initially. Okay, so let's go over to one of these apps over here. I don't know why it keeps doing that.
they have a, what do you call that, one of those cursors? Stylus?
Yeah.
Do you have a stylus? Want me to try it? Back again?
It's not thin. Now let's see if that works. It's not thin. I don't know why.
May just want to glue it. Its receptors are.
They've been down. Right, right. Yes, it plugged in.
You're talking about turning off and turning back on?
Yeah. Hard on.
Okay, well that's doesn't have anything to do with the screen over here. I guess that's what you get when you're not getting any signal coming through here.
Is our technical person gone? Like,
Yeah, Blake said, yeah, Blake said here.
is the keyboard? That's a problem. Is it reading that?
Let's see what happens now. Now when I press that, mirror. I don't know, maybe I turned that, the mirroring thing, maybe I turned that off.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's give this another try and see how that works. I think I might know what it did wrong. Okay.
Come on. Train spotting.
Okay, so get back on track here.
Look at that, it's upside down.
Yeah, there you go. This app sometimes acts up a little bit. Let's see how this works.
But it's working, that's good.
Yeah. All right, so let's zoom in here a little bit. Okay, so we can, so we see the whole brain here, and we can take away parts of the brain. So we take away the cortex of the brain, and we'll take away the cerebellum, and we'll take away some of these nerves. Okay, and so what you're left with over here is brainstem, and then this part right over here is something called the pons, and then right above that you have the midbrain. So the midbrain is a very simple part of the brain. Generally, the lower down you get, the more simplistic the nervous system is. So the brainstem would just have your the most basic survival skills of all: breathing, heart rate, keeping your blood pressure up, and then right above that is the next level. So if we look over here, and let's see, we can do it. You can see right over here is about where the ventral tegmental area would be. So that starts off in the midbrain. And then the nucleus accumbens would be right up around here in an area of the brain called the ventral striatum. And that's between the midbrain and the limbic system, often what people call the reptilian brain. And so the point is that these things start off in very simplistic parts of the brain. If you want another illustration of this, we can look at this over here. So over here, not the fruit fly, but the other one, you see a shark brain right over there. So you can see how similar that looks. So sharks are very primitive animals, so the part of the brain that the reward pathway starting off, is a very basic survival part of the brain. And so the way that it generally works is that the more simplistic parts of the brain, the parts that are devoted more towards your basic survival skills, can override the rest of the brain. You're always going to favor breathing and your heart rate and keeping your blood pressure up over everything else, you know, and then you're going to go to the next level up. So when we come to other areas of the brain, we're going to go to the prefrontal cortex next, which is a higher thinking part of the brain. These parts of the brain that are in the brainstem, the midbrain, the ventral striatum, these can override. You know, when the stimulation of that part of the brain gets strong enough, then it's going to override everything else. I mean, you can think of it like, you know, if you're underwater, you're going to hold your breath because you're going to think, okay, if I take in a breath, all I'm going to get is a lung full of water. But eventually your brain is going to override that, and you're going to do that anyway, despite that you know that's not going to do you any good. Okay. Okay, so the next part of the reward pathway, so go back over here, so you see that the next place that the reward pathway travels to is the prefrontal cortex. That's the next place that all these neurons are traveling to. And so the prefrontal cortex, in contrast to areas like the midbrain and the ventral striatum, is a higher thinking, cognitive, executive functioning part of the brain. And another thing that is really important to know about it is it's the part of the brain that keeps us from doing something that is going to get us injured or possibly killed, lose our job, get fired, end up in a divorce, things like that. You get these basic impulses from other parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex screens that and says, okay, well, wait a minute, you know, I know you really want to do that, but is that really a good idea? That's something that separates us from other animals, is that we have that ability to regulate those things and to regulate those impulses. And so this is something else that illustrates that. So you see over here, you've got a human brain. That's a chimpanzee brain, cat brain. And so the blue is the prefrontal cortex. So you can see in humans, that part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is much larger than it is in any other animal. So for instance, a chimpanzee, it's about 15% of the brain. And chimpanzees share about 98.5% of our DNA. But that 1.5% is focused in very specific areas, and that's what makes us so much different from other primates. So even though that's only a small percentage of the DNA, it's focused, you know, and the area that it probably makes the biggest difference in is the prefrontal cortex. You know, and that's, you know, so even though it's a small 1.5%, that is able to exert enough of an effect to make us very different from other animals and from chimpanzee and so forth. Okay, and then the last place that the signals go to in the reward pathway is the limbic system. The limbic system is towards the center of the brain. I like to describe it as, if you think of the brain as an avocado, the pit of the avocado would be about where the limbic system is. And the limbic system contains a lot of different structures. But we don't need to really, we can just focus on two parts of the limbic system to really have an understanding of how addiction works. And one of those is the amygdala. The amygdala is like the emotions, anger, fear, things like that. And when the amygdala is turned off, then we generally feel very happy emotions, very good emotions. The other part of the limbic system that I want to focus on is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is, what that does is it allows us to convert short-term memory into long-term memory. So without the hippocampus, we're not able to do that. So if anybody's ever seen movies like Memento or 50 First Dates, okay, some people have seen those movies. Most of you have probably seen one of those movies. So the part of the brain that would have been damaged would be the hippocampus. And although that's not entirely accurate portrayal of what would happen, it's not actually that far off. That gives us some idea of what actually would happen if the hippocampus was damaged, and there are people out there with damage to this part of their brain, and what happens to them is they end up getting stuck in time. Because they can't incorporate any new memories. It's like if you're in a drunken blackout or something like that, and you just stay in that because you're not able to incorporate any new memories. And so if you have serious enough damage to the hippocampus at the age of 20, for instance, then a person in their 60s or 70s can look in the mirror, not recognize themselves, because for them it's like everything stopped at the age of 20. They can remember everything that happened before the injury. They can't remember anything that happened after the injury. So the reason why, and then here's, there you can see the limbic system right there, and so you can see how that's in the center of the brain. So this would be sort of the next level up after the midbrain, and people sometimes call this the reptilian brain. This is, where your impulses come from, things like anger and fear, and also joy and that feeling of euphoria that you get comes from the limbic system. This is the real impulsive part of the brain. I'm going to show you something else here, as long as this thing is working. But you can see here the amygdala right here, and you can see the hippocampus. What you notice about those two areas of the brain is that they are right next to each other. Okay, they're connected, and they're very, very highly interconnected to each other. So what that means is when the amygdala is stimulated, or when it's turned off really strongly, then the hippocampus gets stimulated in a strong way too. And let's see if I can give you another view of it here. Let's see. I don't know, there must be something wrong with the connection or something. It's standing here before, I wasn't having a problem. Okay, I don't know, maybe I'll try to reboot this a little bit later and show you guys this all together. Yeah, typical, it's, we tried it out before this and it was working just fine, and now we're having problems.
When you rebooted it, did you just come right back to what you needed, or?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. Let me see if I'm going to try to put it sort of together, so I'm not, turning it on and turning it off, because then we'll run out of time here.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll try to come back to that. Sorry that that's not working as well as I'd like it to. All right, so this is basically what's saying what I was talking about before. And also there's a neurotransmitter called glutamate as well that is also very important in memory too. That is in the pathway between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. So when your limbic system is stimulated, it's telling your brain this is important. This is a really important thing. You need to remember this. And that linkage that you have between the hippocampus and the amygdala, if we just look at this, okay, then we have a better understanding of that. Because you look at this and then you think, okay, well, what are your memories from this day? Do you have very vivid memories? Do you remember things, like they happened yesterday? And most people are going to say yes. And people noticed this before, after President John F. Kennedy was shot. That was the first time I think people really noticed this phenomenon, that people really had very vivid memories years later and even decades later. So this illustrates how when something is attached to a very strong emotional content, we tend to remember that very well, and we remember it without even trying. Okay, we don't really have to make any effort to remember it or anything like that. As opposed to you're trying to remember to pay a bill, or you're studying for a test for a master's or something like that, and you're making an effort, and yet you don't remember that as well. Or you remember it maybe for the test, but then a few months later you're like, well, what was that I studied before? I don't remember any of that. So why is it? Why is it that the brain is set up that way? because it doesn't seem to necessarily help us that much. In fact, this is something that can hurt us. This is something that, that can be associated with PTSD and that kind of thing. And it also works for positive emotions as well. So, for people who can remember a man landing on the moon for the first time, a first child being born, something like that, maybe a big promotion. Those things are associated with really strong positive emotional content. We tend to remember those very well too, without really trying. So the question is, why is the brain? Why does the brain behave this way? Why is it that we remember this information that sometimes just doesn't really seem to be that important to our lives, and other things that we're really trying to remember, we have a harder time doing that, and we have to work to do it. So if we think, if we go back in time, we have to remember that civilization has been around for about 7,000 years or so, and that was just a small part of humanity. That was around the Nile River, the Fertile Crescent. Maybe that was 2 or 3% of all the humans that were in existence at that time. And so the rest of our species was exposed to civilization much later than that. We've been around, we think, for about 1 million years now, I think anthropologists are saying, or a little bit longer than that. And then the changes that, the way that the brain develops, we didn't just develop from our primates and then wipe the slate clean and then start anew with the development of the brain. We tended to build on top of those things that were already, those survival mechanisms that were already built into the brain. So we have been around, our brains have been developed for a much, much longer time in this uncivilized world than in this civilized world that we're living in. And so really our brains are much, much more designed actually really for that kind of environment than it is for this artificial world that we've built around us. So if we go back in time, maybe say 10,000 years before we had all of this, then it makes a little bit more sense to us. So if we think of something, a negative emotional experience, we'll start off with that first. Like 10,000 years ago, stumbling upon a dangerous animal, a bear or a lion or something like that, and you're able to survive that experience, the more you remember from that experience, the more details you remember from that experience, the better your chances of survival are going to be. What you remember about the place, how it felt, what time of day it was, what it smelled like, just all the little details that you can remember that are going to help you to really realize, okay, what is it about that place, that environment, those circumstances, that I have to avoid this area, or that I have to use my prefrontal cortex now to come up with strategies so that if I go up into that area again, I'm going to bring some other people with me, and we're going to bring some certain kinds of weapons and that kind of thing in order to deal with this. So those of us who were of our ancestors who were able to remember those experiences better, the better you could remember that, the better your chances of survival would be. Those would be the ones that would survive, the ancestors that would survive. They would tend to pass on those genes to the next generation. Those traits would become more prominent, and they would become further encoded within our DNA. If we look at an example of a positive emotional experience, so the example that I like to use is hunting a buffalo, because that would be red fatty meat. Okay, that's something that would give us a lot of dopamine. And the more that we could remember from the hunt and just all the little different circumstances that may weigh into our success with the kill, the better hunters that we would become. And then again, those who remembered more details would be the ones that would survive, would tend to pass on their genes to the next generation, and so on. We know that dopamine is released not only when we get the reward, but in anticipation of the reward as well. So dopamine would be released not only when you're getting the reward, in other words, when we're eating that red fatty meat, but it would also be released during the hunt itself, during the kill, during the preparation of the food, and so on. And so, if the more dopamine that's released, generally the more important something is for survival. So we think of red fatty meat, we think of that as being bad, right? Okay, well, so why is it that we crave that more? Why is it that that releases more dopamine? Well, if we go back in time again 10,000 years, that would be something that would give us more substance. It's something that would allow us to survive a longer period of time. We would put priority over that, over say chicken or fish or something like that, if we could get buffalo meat, because that's something that would sustain us for a longer period of time. So back when we were hunter-gatherers, that was not a bad thing, that was actually a good thing. We didn't have that excess of food like we have now. We think of things like sweets, candy, the brownies, the chocolate chip cookies over here. We think of that as also being bad. But that's processed sugar. 10,000 years ago, it was not processed sugar, and that was a very quick source of food for our brains, and a source of energy for our brains. And so, when we would get that, our brain, dopamine would be released. We would crave that. We would want more of that, and so it would format our brains, and it would be telling us, this is good. Get more of this, because this is something that's really important for survival. So what dopamine does is it formats the brain. It lets the brain know what is important for survival. That's the way the brain is set up. That's the way the reward pathway is set up. That's what it's set up to do, basically. So we look at things that, I'm just checking my time, okay? And I have till 12:30, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we look at things that release dopamine. So we know that all the things that are important for survival, dopamine is released, food, water, sleep, sex. Okay.
You know what time it is? Oh, you have a
Oh yeah, I've got my iPhone here. So all these things, especially when we're really hungry, especially when we're really thirsty, especially when we're really tired, sex is obviously something that's important for the species as a whole. So dopamine is released with anything that's important for survival. It's also released with things that we tend to enjoy. It could be hanging out with our families, or maybe doing something we really like to do on weekends, like hiking or sailing or skiing or something like that. So what happens when so now we add alcohol and drugs to the picture, okay? So how is this different from these other things? The thing about drugs and alcohol is these also release dopamine, like those other things, but they release more dopamine. We tend to get much more dopamine from drugs than we get from food, water, sex, sleep, hanging out with our family, skiing, anything like that, especially if we have a predisposition. We can get 8 to 10 times more dopamine from this. And a lot of this is just how we've manipulated these things. So it's not necessarily just what's in the environment, but it's also what we've done to those things in the environment. For instance, the coca-rethroxylin plant. The Incas have been chewing that plant for thousands of years. It grows about 3,000 to 4,000 feet in the Andes. And when they're chewing those leaves, they're getting about 1% cocaine. So it's basically like strong coffee when they're getting it. But what have we done? We found ways to concentrate it to 100%. And then we've come up with other ways of taking it, like snorting it, that gets it into our brains more quickly, and injecting it and inhaling it. And so we can manipulate these things too. So it has the advantage of not only giving us a much stronger dose of the dopamine, but we can also manipulate it much more easily. We can increase the dose, and we can take it more frequently, and we can change the route of administration. And that all makes it more addictive. So here's some other examples. So for instance, marijuana in the 60s and 70s, obviously that's something that grows out in the environment. But we've genetically engineered and manipulated it. And in the late 60s, early 70s, the THC content, the active ingredient in the marijuana plant that gets you high, was about 0.2%. Now it's generally around 8 to 11%, can be up to 50% with the hashish oil. And so by genetically engineering it, now we've made it like 40, 50 times stronger than it was like in the late 60s. The invention is still, alcohol actually is something that exists in the natural environment, because all you need is a source of sugar, which you can get from fruit, source of heat, which you get from the sun, and yeast, which you get from the air, and bam, you get alcohol. So we've actually observed deer and squirrels and animals like that drunk. The alcohol content, though, that the way that chemical reaction works, you're not able to get the alcohol content above about 12% or so. So we came up with the still. We found out that alcohol boils at a lower, it has a lower boiling point than water. So we found, so we invented the still where we could collect the gas, the steam, recondense that, and then add that back in, and then increase the percentage to 50%, 60% alcohol now. I think one of the more interesting examples is the Bayer company in Germany who made Bayer aspirin, and Bayer himself, what he had done was he took salicylic acid, which is from the bark of a tree, and that's something that goes back about 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks used that. He added 2 acetyl groups to that. That's something that has some carbons and some hydrogens, but he added 2 acetyl groups to the salicylic acid to create aspirin. And what that did was that eliminated a lot of the nasty side effects of the salicylic acid. So you got more of the good things and less of the bad things from salicylic acid. And that's what aspirin is. So he thought, okay, well maybe I can do the same thing to morphine, and I can come up with a cure for codeine and for morphine addiction. So he added those 2 acetyl groups to morphine, and he came up with diacetylmorphine. Well, diacetylmorphine is the generic name for heroin. And so he created heroin. And so in a way that kind of worked, right? Because people took the heroin and it's like, oh yeah, I'll get off the morphine and the codeine, and I'll take the heroin. What he actually did was that he made it easier for the heroin to get through the blood-brain barrier, so it gets to our brains more quickly, we get more of a rush. So, and here's the blood-brain barrier right over here. It's, if you look at this picture, the green cells right over there, that represents the blood-brain barrier. So what those are is cells that are lining the blood vessel. So this would be the blood vessel over here, and then this would be the tissues of the brain over here. So normally there's space between these cells, but in the brain they abut each other very, very closely over here. That prevents things from getting from the bloodstream into the tissues. But if we make something more like basically the chemistry of the cells over here, in other words, we make it more fatty, more lipophilic, then it can get through very easily. So what Bayer did was when he diacetylated morphine, he made it more lipophilic so that it could get through this barrier more easily. So we've done all these things throughout time to make these drugs more effective and to make them stronger and to feel the effect more quickly so that there's more of a rush. This shows different methods of administration. You actually see that inhalation is actually, we feel the effect even more quickly than intravenously. Not a big difference, but those are the two, those are pretty close, but inhalation is actually a little bit more, a little bit faster than intravenous. Then after that, snorting sublingual. And so you can see how we've done a lot of manipulation to get drugs into this category so that we can snort them, shoot them, and we've come up with things like crystal meth or crack cocaine that we can smoke. So this is something I want to show you guys another thing from the app here. I'm gonna try to go back and do this all at one time. But you can get a pretty good idea from this. As you go out towards the smaller bronchial tubes, eventually what you're going to do is you're going to get to these little grape-like structures, which are called alveoli. These are microscopic. And each of these are lined by these capillaries. So that's why oxygen can get very easily from the lungs into the bloodstream. But so can drugs when you smoke them. And so the surface area that you have is tremendous. So it just gets into the bloodstream very quickly that way. And so we've come up with a lot of ways of being able to smoke drugs. So we're very good at manipulating these things. So what this means is that in the natural environment, these things can't compete. So your brain is eventually saying, I don't want this anymore. It's not a question of wanting anymore. It's a question of, I need this. Your brain eventually ends up saying, I need this to survive. And not only that, but this is the most important thing the survival paradigm. This is at the very top because you're getting way more dopamine from it than you're getting from anything else. And you're getting the dopamine to your brain more quickly than you're getting it from these other sources. So you start off with something that looks like this maybe, where you have, where this number one would be the most important, and then these things would be less important. And drugs and alcohol may start off at the bottom of the list, but as time goes on, this can very quickly make its way up to the top of the list. And this can be, we could actually, put this like way up here and all of these way down here when a person really progresses in their addiction. So now that we know that, we can have a better understanding. When we see an animal pressing this lever 5,000 times in an hour, and we see that ignoring food and water and actually starving to death, or standing on an electrified grate and actually burning to death because it prefers to get the drug over burning to death, we actually have an understanding of why this occurs. This actually explains why this occurs and why drugs and alcohol are so powerful, and why we need help really, and why we need strategies to deal with these things, and how willpower, just using willpower alone is, for people who are probably true addicts, alcoholics, is not going to work. So and then this is just another picture of our rat, again in the Skinner box, and preferring to press the lever to give it the drug than to give it the food or water, or to avoid being electrocuted to death. So, and then other things happen as well. So another thing that happens, I'm going to go through this, and then we're going to try to go back to these apps for a second. So another thing that ends up happening is that the prefrontal cortex ends up getting removed from the pathway. So we can actually see this from things like SPECT scans and functional MRIs and PET scans. And these are scans that look at the brain anatomy, but they also look at the brain activity. Functional MRIs look at how much blood flow is going to different parts of the brain. The more blood flow that you have going to a certain part of the brain, the more active that part of the brain generally is. PET scans and SPECT scans generally they can look at other things, but most common thing that they look at is glucose metabolism. That's the fuel for the brain. So again, the more glucose that is being used, the more active that part of the brain generally is. We'll see something that looks like this over here. It's kind of a neat picture. You see something that looks like a hole over here. It's not an actual hole. The more active parts of the brain will tend to show up as these bright colors, and the less active parts of the brain will tend to show up as darker spots. This is a SPECT scan right over here. And so what you're seeing over here is not an actual hole, but you're seeing like a hole in the activity, basically. Decreased activity at these dopamine 1 receptors, and that's in the prefrontal cortex. So that's in a person, normal, that's in a person who got decreased dopamine 1 activity secondary to addiction progressing, and the dopamine receptors, the activity of those becoming decreased over time. So let me see if I can, let's try one more the standard way and see if anything happens. I'm not too, I'm hoping for the best, but expecting the worst, or being prepared for the worst. Okay, so let me turn this off and turn it back on again. Let's reboot it. Right now I'm waiting for it to turn off completely. It takes a little while. Okay, now it's off. And turn it back on again. It takes a little bit of time. I don't know if there's any faster iPads out there. They're probably about they're all the same, I'm sure.
Yeah, I have it. Same thing.
I always have a tendency to think that mine's slower than everybody else's.
No, not true. They're all the same.
But if you have more apps on it, it's go slower.
I don't think so.
But probably not turning off and turning on the other things, but. Well, it can bog it down. we can bog it down. But I think just turning off and
Because
turning
I was
off.
thinking this was your desktop.
No, it's not.
What is
No.
that?
I guess that's just like that's just the screen that comes on when there's nothing else, no other signal going through it.
I think this is Apple TV. Apple TV screen.
Oh, okay.
Well, that seems to work.
Yay.
All right.
There's your iPad.
Yeah, that's my iPad right there.
Yeah.
All right.
You see some of these apps.
Yeah, I've got the whole body on here.
Cool.
So I could have spent a lot less time inhaling formaldehyde if I had this in medical school. What was that?
There's nothing like hands-on.
Oh, yeah. So, you know, this is the limbic system right over here. And you can see this is, interestingly enough, this is the olfactory bulb right over here. So that's why things that strong smells can also be associated with very powerful memories, because that's actually part of the limbic system. So you can see this is the amygdala right over here, and then this is the hippocampus, and whoops, multiple select here. Okay, so amygdala, hippocampus, and again over on the other side, hippocampus and the amygdala. So again, you can see how they are just directly connected to each other. And we can see tons and tons of connections between those two parts of the brain.
What were you saying was on the end? There's two?
The amygdala, I think, is what you're talking about. That's the
Side-
amygdala right there.
No, you were pointing to
Oh, okay,
the
the
light
olfactory
bulb.
bulb. Yeah, the olfactory bulb would be right there and there. So things that are so strong, you might have noticed that sometimes things that have a strong smell associated with them can be associated, or not even strong smell, but certain smells can be associated with really powerful memories. And that's because the olfactory bulb, which is where, you know, that's the part of the nervous system that's connected directly to, that's our sense of smell. Basically, that's that part of the brain. So things, you know, so that's connected directly to the limbic system, and so it's not really surprising that that smells are sometimes associated with very powerful memories.
But where is the like in this, where would the prefrontal cortex be?
Okay, so I'm going to go back here and show you guys that. Okay, so this is the excuse me. This is the prefrontal cortex. So the reward pathway is basically going to start off in, you know, your ventral tegmental area is going to be right around in here, okay, and then your nucleus accumbens is going to be right around in here, and then from those parts of the brain, it's going to the reward pathway is going to go to the prefrontal cortex, and then the next place it's going to go is to these parts of the limbic system. So that's your reward pathway right there. So here, let me get out of this for a second. Yes.
Yeah, can I ask, I don't know if this is at the same time, but where does predisposition, if I can say it right,
Predisposition?
yeah, where is that? Is that in the brain? When someone is
Somebody's
predisposed to being addict, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
where is that genetically? Is it in the brain? Is it, where do you
Yeah.
find that?
You know, I'm going to go over that in very soon here.
Okay.
It's in different parts. And predisposition comes from all sorts of areas. There's a whole bunch of different genes and other things that are involved.
So Doc, let me understand this. With the nucleus incumbents, they say that people with a disease of addiction have this built-in forgiveness. So despite of a negative consequence or something happened, we return right back to that source of whatever it was, the negative consequence, this built-in forgetter. So is something happening here that overrides where the nucleus incumbents overrides the hippocampus?
Is something happening?
The built-in forgetter. Like say for instance, the alcoholic tears his car up, has a fight, whatever. The next day, they're right back at the same thing. So if something
Yeah.
overriding the system, something gets
Yeah, well, something is it's overriding your prefrontal cortex. I mean, your common sense, and your moral code, and your, the part of the brain that says, that tells you to do things that makes sense, and to, even though there's something that you really kind of want to do or you would like to do, that there's going to be consequences. It's the prefrontal cortex that really overrides that. And prevents you from doing things. And so this is what we see on SPECT scans, is we see, or PET scans or functional MRIs, is we'll see this, we'll see parts of the brain lighting up. So we'll see this part of the brain lighting up where you have the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, and then you'll see the prefrontal cortex lighting up as well, and then you'll see parts of the limbic system lighting up too. Now, what happens later on as the addiction progresses is we start to see this.
They're lighting up, having not used, it's showing that it's lit up, or are you showing what?
Oh, I'm going to show you in a second.
But this is a person who hasn't used drugs, alcohol yet, what we see here.
Yeah, or very early in their addiction. So as a person later in their addiction, now you're going to see this. You're going to see this part of the brain is going to go dark. And these parts of the brain are actually going to be lighting up. But this part of the brain, you're going to see right in here, you're going to be seeing, it's going to look dark over here. And essentially, the reward pathway has bypassed that. So you're talking about bypassing before. So this part of the brain right over here has basically been removed, not 100%, but like 90% removed. And the further you are in the addiction, the more it gets removed. And so that part of the brain that is so important for us making intelligent decisions, ends up going. Now the good news is that during recovery, and I want to make sure that I get to that as well, this does start to come back. So the brain does heal. But we do lose that, and that's something that reinforces addiction, and it compounds our problems and that kind of thing. Let me see, what else was I going to show you here? Okay, let me show you this picture of the moms over here. It's definitely easier when I'm doing it as I'm going along, so I'm used to doing it then. And this is what I was showing you before with different methods of administration. So here you can see this is a much better picture actually of the alveoli that you have in the lungs. So again, these are microscopic once you get to the end of the bronchial tubes, and so you can see how those are all lined with those capillaries right there. So you can see how tremendous the surface area is. So how quickly drugs can get into the bloodstream when they're smoked. And that helps explain why things like crack cocaine and crystal meth have become so popular. Okay.
Yes, so the decreased PFC activation can be a consequence of addictive behavior, let's say, but it can also be a cause, right?
Yeah, I mean, it starts to contribute to the problems. I mean, there's a lot of things that do. Yeah, there's other things as well. I'm going to show you something here real quickly here. There's, yeah, I mean, it tends to be a vicious cycle. That's one of the things that, that's why we really need to stop it as soon as we can, stop it in its tracks. Because it tends to be a vicious reinforcing cycle. Okay, so let's see, we're here. So here's another example of that. So our bodies, we try to maintain balance. It's called homeostasis, so we try to keep our temperature around 98.6 degrees. Another one of those mechanisms that doesn't seem to make sense is, the reason why it's hard to lose weight when you're dieting is because, that's homeostasis. Our bodies try to maintain a certain set point. Now, it seems like it's not something that's really going to help us out very much. We're trying to lose weight, we're trying to live healthier and get down to a healthier weight. But if we think of 10,000 years ago, again, when we didn't have this surplus of food, then those of us who were able to maintain our weight were the ones that survived. Were the ones who didn't starve to death. Okay, so we built that mechanism into, that mechanism became more entrenched in us because that was some basic survival skill. So homeostasis is actually very important for survival, or it's a very important survival mechanism, even though some of it's outdated. So one of the things that happens is you can see over here, these could be receptors for anything, but let's say they're dopamine receptors over here. What's going to happen is, and this is one of the reasons why we see these changes on SPECT scans and on functional MRIs and PET scans, is that with time, the receptors over here start to diminish. So you have dopamine that's being released. What happens is if you're releasing dopamine in large amounts all the time, then the brain recognizes that as, this is not normal. Okay, so I've got to bring things back into balance. I'm getting too much dopamine, so I've got to adjust for this somehow. So how does the brain adjust? It starts reducing these receptors, and you get fewer receptors over time.
And that's tolerance.
That's tolerance, and that's also, that's also something that's going to reinforce the addiction because we're going to be miserable all the time. We're going to have a decreased sensitivity to dopamine.
Well, if there's a fairly consistent supply of increased dopamine, wouldn't that eventually become like the new normal?
It does become the new normal, yeah. But our bodies try to adjust for that too, but the brain also recognizes that as not being normal. And so it tries to adjust for that.
But eventually, it's like over time, that would then become the new normal. It's like, okay, now this is what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, that's what your brain is actually thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where does it come in, Doc, when we substitute one thing for another? I put down the dope, but now sex become a big thing, or shopping, or.
Yeah, I'm going to show that to you real quick. Paul, you have a question?
What happens with the hyperactivated amygdala but no stimulus? So like when a substance is activating that, or even like the nucleus accumbens VAT area, with the prefrontal cortex being bypassed, what happens? Because there's kind of like no stimulus or processing happening.
So you were talking about a hyperstimulated amygdala.
Yeah, or really any of these. Sorry?
So I'm sorry. So that you have the hyperstimulated amygdala, and then what was it after that?
With really no external stimulus.
So I think what you're talking about is we actually see that the amygdala in people whose addiction progresses, we see that the amygdala actually gets bigger. So people are taking drugs to relieve. This could also represent other things, by the way. So this is going to happen with other things, like for instance GABA, which helps us to relax, right? So the receptors for GABA are also going to decrease over time. So we actually end up making the anxiety worse. And same thing for anything else. Whatever we're self-medicating, that tends to actually get worse over time. The amygdala, and I've got a picture of that, but not here, but you actually see the amygdala will get bigger, and then all the nerves that are branching out from it, they'll become short and truncated.
What happens in that case?
Well, what happens so that animal is going to be more susceptible to fear and anger and frustration and things like that, or in us, it's the same thing. And it's also going to be, so the amygdala is going to be, the amygdala becomes bigger, but also things that receive dopamine, parts of the brain, I'm sorry, the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens, so the amygdala gets bigger and the nucleus accumbens, the nerve endings that are branching out from it become shorter and more truncated. So it becomes harder to stimulate that pleasurable part of the brain and to feel pleasure. Yeah. And so this is going to make us resistant to the effects of dopamine. So it's going to be harder and harder to feel pleasure. It's going to be harder and harder to get relaxation if we're trying to get GABA and so on and so forth. So these problems actually end up getting worse, and that's a good thing to let the patients know. And this is another way to look at it. So there's something called the hedonic set point, which really is, that's not an actual thing. That's something that we've come up to sort of to explain this phenomenon. But basically, it's the same thing causing this. I've used an example of a roller coaster right over here, but this could also represent other things like being with our families, or like a hobby that we really enjoy, like painting or playing guitar or something like that. What happens is, because those receptors are being reduced over time, that the hedonic set point gets higher and higher, and pretty soon all of those things are falling way below this line. The only thing that gives us enough dopamine to get above that line is drugs. And so this is going to reinforce the addiction too, because you're way below this line all the time. You're going to be depressed. A person is going to be really super, major depression, and the only way to get them out of that hole, for them to get out of that hole temporarily, even though it's making things worse in the long run, is to take the substance.
Do things like Vivitrol and naltrexone raise the hedonic set point?
There's nothing. I don't know if there's any studies actually looking
Showing it's an
directly
anhedonia in
at
some
that.
people, right? So there's an anhedonia some people are prescribed.
Yeah.
Those blockers, so we know what's happening with dopamine response.
I don't know if that's something that's been looked at directly, but you would think that there would be, since it is blocking the dopamine, that there would be, that's blocking the opiates, that, and therefore blocking the dopamine.
So any
dopamine,
opioid
opiates
receptor
is
that's
going to block
blocked
dopamine.
will raise the set point? Or is it specific to specific subtypes?
Yeah, let me see. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of what should happen as a result of that. I don't know if that would be necessarily the case, because you're actually doing the opposite. So I don't know that you might get some anhedonia just from blocking the opiate and blocking the dopamine. I would think it would be more related to that. The pharmacology would suggest that. I don't know if there's any studies looking at that specifically.
So if someone were to take amino acids like GABA and glutamate, would that balance out the brain chemistry to addiction?
Well, there's nothing that we know of that's really effective as far as taking GABA and glutamate that actually works on an experimental basis. People have looked at, there's no conclusive studies to show that doing that actually makes a difference. Well, what I think is going to make a bigger difference is really looking for, what we want to do in treatment is we want to look for natural sources of getting that dopamine. So we want to want to get people connected with support groups, and we want to get them connected, we want to get them into hobbies that they're really interested in, and get them into things like yoga and meditation, and stuff like that. And that's something that's been found to be that's what's been found to be the most effective. And there's a way, for some reason, getting these things in a natural way is much more effective than getting them in an unnatural way. I mean, the problem with doing all of these things is that they end up, whatever you're self-medicating for tends to get worse over time. Meditation, for instance, there's been some studies on that now. We have some good evidence from studies, that the effect, for instance, if you look at a SPECT scan or a functional MRI, we see that those parts of the brain that become more active, that we know contribute to relaxation or to concentration, those actually increase with time. Your concentration gets better, your relaxation gets better, your level of calm actually improves, rather than decreasing over time, which is what happens with drugs.
So do you believe that EFT, the tapping technique, or say cardio exercise, that helps as well?
Yeah, I think all of those things, and it's going to be different for everybody, but everybody needs to find some plan and things that works for them. I think that's, for me, that's usually gonna involve 12-step groups, some combination of 12-step groups, and other things, and some other things, you know, like martial arts or getting into something else that you really enjoy, music or hiking or something like that.
Can you address
So-
the Jean question?
I was just gonna say, it is
Oh, it's 1:30.
it is 1:30, but this is fascinating, so, but I don't wanna keep anybody, but if you have a little more time, and if we wanna go over, we can maybe go over 10 minutes or so, if you have a couple more questions, or if there's something specific that you wanted to.
Or we could see about going through it and then taking questions after that?
Yeah, I mean, if anybody needs to leave, that's fine, but if you have time and you wanna stay, this room is available, so, we can continue if it works for.
So I'll tell you what, I'm gonna go through a few things for about the next 10 minutes, and then I'll take questions after that.
Okay.
So, and this may answer some of your questions right over here. So, all right, so I gotta watch my time here. But that's something that, again, reinforces the addiction. And remember that the dopamine, oops. Turn this off and on.
We'll have to get back to the
Yeah.
I'm gonna do the raffle real quick, and then whoever wants to stay, is that okay?
Sure.
You wanna pick it?
Yeah, okay.
If they're here, then.
I can read that.
I think you just left. Well, pick a different one, here.
Shake it up, shake it up.
Okay, Janaki, sure you wanna give her to, Amy? Are some people staying, or?
Yeah.
You staying?
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, I'm just going to try to go over some things in the next 10 minutes, just to tie a few other things together here. Just tip that over. So, another good thing to know is that dopamine is a common link between these. We know that all these different drugs, they end up releasing dopamine. Whatever drug you're looking at, dopamine is released. And we can look at different drugs. You know, we can go through them one by one and show you how they end up releasing dopamine. They do it in different ways, and they release other neurotransmitters so that they feel differently. But every drug we found that is addictive releases dopamine in large amounts. So, so if we think about this, really you become addicted to the dopamine and not the drug. So I came up with this analogy, you might call it the chocolate analogy, which is, you know, you have this guy Fred, and he's under house arrest, and he's got a closet full of 10,000 Reese's Pieces and another full of 10,000 Hershey's chocolate bars. And one day the police, and so he gorges on the Hershey's chocolate bars. He thinks he has a real problem with the chocolate bars. He can eat just a few Reese's Pieces and be fine with that. But then one day, if the police come and they take away all of his chocolate bars, he's left only with the Reese's Pieces. What's he going to do? He's going to attempt to gorge on those. You know, because he's not addicted to the chocolate bars per se. He's addicted to the sugar in those. And so it's the same way with dopamine. So, you know, so you were talking about this before, was that, you know, if people will try to switch to another drug, and this is a very common problem, actually, that you find in treatment centers, is that people will, and I found it's really important to ask, is that, okay, when you talk about addiction, are you talking about all drugs of addiction, or are you just talking about your drug of choice? Because I found, in my experience, that often people were talking about, you know, that I'm also certified as a counselor, that people were often just, you know, would come out that they were only talking about their drug of choice. And people would think that, okay, well, I was always able to have just a couple of drinks, or I was able to just smoke a couple puffs of the joint and not have a problem. So I can go back to that stuff, right? But it's easy to do those things in moderation. It's easy to do those things in moderation if you're getting plenty of dopamine from another source. But once you're still craving that dopamine. So once you take that other thing away, and you're getting the dopamine from the marijuana, from the alcohol, or whatever, you're still craving that you'll tend to get addicted to that new drug, or you'll tend to leave to another drug. Withdrawal symptoms, keep in mind that withdrawal, or that addiction rather, that's a function of the reward pathway. It's not a function of withdrawal symptoms. We can get addicted to drugs that have no addictive potential at all. For instance, blood pressure medications, beta blockers, things like that. And we've actually found that in animals, if we cut the reward pathway, we can do that with acid or with a scalpel or something like that. If we cut the reward pathway so that the dopamine can't travel anywhere, it can't go anywhere, the animal doesn't want the drug anymore. And even if it's going through severe withdrawal symptoms, the withdrawal symptoms do play a role, but ultimately the important factor is not the withdrawal symptoms. And so people will make this distinction, or we're getting better about it, but between psychological addiction and physical addiction, it's really completely irrelevant, and we need to really get rid of that idea. Because how physically addictive something is doesn't matter. What's matters, really, they're all physically addicting in your brain. Okay, so what really matters is that stimulation of the reward pathway. So, I mean, we think about it, cocaine and things like, alcohol is, and benzodiazepines are the worst in terms of withdrawal symptoms. Those are the ones that can kill you, but those are not more addictive than things like cocaine or heroin.
How do you propose to cut the reward pathway?
I
mean, I have my
well,
ideas where you're at.
Yeah. Well, they've done it, the neuroscientists have done it in experiments with scalpel or with acid and things like that.
With surgery?
Yeah. Of course, you can't do that in a human, and then you wouldn't feel any pleasure.
No psychobehavioral techniques?
I don't know. Well, let me. I'm going to get through this, and we'll go through some questions. So I mean, I think that's an important concept to have. And we were also bringing this up. These guys, Gerald McLaren and his colleagues, who were looking at mice, and we were talking about what causes addiction and what are the factors that contribute. So they found this strain of mice that were that were alcoholics, basically. They found them just by accident. They loved drinking alcohol, which was really unusual. They would drink concentration of water up to 70% alcohol. And normally they would spit out something that was 2% alcohol. So they found this genetic strain of mice. So they knew genetics played a role here. But then what they did was they took the non-alcoholic mice, and they did one of three things. They took one group and they put them in a small tube for a while, so they subjected them to some stress. They took another group and they injected them with alcohol over and over again. They took a third group and they nutritionally deprived them, especially of precursors for dopamine. What they found out was that when they did that to the animals started to act like the genetic strain that craved the alcohol. And when they took away the stressors, they continued to do this. And then when they actually did autopsies on them, they actually found that their brains had structural and chemical changes that were like the genetic strain of mice that liked the alcohol in the first place. So we know, so there's a whole bunch of there's different factors, that contribute. So we know that there's exposure to the substance, we know that there's behavioral factors, and we know that there's genes. And there's, so it's a combination of those things. And they contribute in a different way. This is just, this is another way that this is one of the ways that genes, work by blocking, antabuse works by blocking this chemical reaction of breaking down alcohol from acetaldehyde to acetate. So acetaldehyde, which is much more toxic than acetate, builds up in your system. Well, people of Chinese and Japanese descent who have a tendency to have much lower incidence. Of course, there is certainly people of Chinese and Japanese descent that have alcoholism, but it's a much lower incidence. And it's thought that one of the reasons why is they tend to have a very weak enzyme, that acetaldehyde dehydrogenase, metabolizing it from the acetaldehyde to acetate, so that it has the same effect, basically, as taking antabuse. And that could explain, so that's just one of the many ways that genes work. And I actually had a chance to observe a Korean friend of mine in college get all flushed and get sick, as actually had a chance to see that in practice. So there's a lot of different genes. They have different levels of penetrance, and we're probably not going to ever come up with a drug or a vaccine not in our lifetimes, I think that's just gonna, that's gonna cure that, that's gonna be a cure, and people aren't gonna have to worry about, going to treatment anymore or anything like that. So it's a complicated thing that involves a lot of different factors, different genes, different environmental factors, and so on.
They're coming close with the cocaine vaccination.
Yeah, I don't
Texas or
believe,
something?
I don't believe that any of that stuff is just gonna be, like it may help, but it's not gonna work by itself. I think we're always gonna need behavioral things and 12 steps and things like that. And we know that it's established with that the co-occurring disorders, strong connection, PTSD, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and so on. So just to touch real quickly on, oh boy, wow, time flies. So so what I was saying before was, if you can see it, it doesn't show up in this as well as I'd like to, but when we were talking about the receptors going away before, I don't know if you can see it really well, but you can actually see that these receptors, they actually end up, they don't go away. They get pulled behind the membrane over here. So they're still there. So you've reached this new state, okay, you've reached this new normal state of the brain, where it's used to getting all this dopamine, but you take drugs away, you take all those drugs away, and all of a sudden it's not being flooded with dopamine anymore. What happens? Those receptors start to come back. Now that takes time, but this is part of the recovery process, and this is one of the things that is done, that is going to help a person to recover, because they're going to be able to start getting that joy back. And one of the things that we do in treatment, and one of the things that's very important for any kind of therapy for people recovering, is to get them to do things that are fun, and to really get them to understand that they can have fun without drugs and alcohol. And there's also something called the placebo effect, where people have actually set up makeshift bars and stuff like that at college campuses, and serve people virgin drinks and watch people actually get drunk, only there's no alcohol or anything like that. So it's a lot of no, it's not the sugars, it's the effect that it has on their brains, that they think that they're getting these substances. We've been conditioned from a very early age in this culture that in order to have fun, you have to have some substance in your body. And so we need to get clients to get used to that idea that you don't. We need to get them over that prejudice that they have that's really been sort of beat into them from a young age. Pavlov's dog, I just want to go over this really quickly, because this is something that really explains how treatment and 12-step groups are really effective. So Pavlov's dog, a lot of you guys know the story of that, but he was a Russian scientist around the turn of the century looking at the digestive system of dogs. Again, nothing to do with behavioral techniques or anything like that that he was looking for, but he noticed every time the cat fed the dogs, walked into the room, the dog would start salivating more. And so he designed an experiment where he would ring a bell, give the dog food, and the dog would start to salivate, and he could ring the bell eventually, and the dog would start to salivate even if he didn't pair it with it. And that became the basis for behavioral therapy. Freudian psychoanalysis, looks at changing our subconscious thoughts, and getting to our subconscious thoughts and changing our behavior. Behavioral therapy looks at changing behavior and then subsequently changing our subconscious thoughts. And so really that wasn't the step that did it. The step that really looked at behavioral therapy was the next step, which was, okay, can we now condition the dog to do something different? So instead of giving the dog food, if we give the dog a bone or something like that, or if we don't give the dog food, will that change this physiological response? And it does. So the dog will salivate less, or will stop salivating, have a different reaction. And so they said, people started saying, okay, well, if somebody has road rage or something like that, rather than things, anger, fear, things like that, and when the amygdala is turned off, then we generally feel very happy emotions, very good emotions. The other part of the limbic system that I want to focus on is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is, what that does is it allows us to convert short-term memory into long-term memory. So without the hippocampus, we're not able to do that. So if anybody's ever seen movies like Memento or 50 First Dates, okay? Some people have seen those movies. Most of you have probably seen one of those movies. So the part of the brain that would have been damaged would be the hippocampus. And although that's not an entirely accurate portrayal of what would happen, it's not actually that far off. That gives us some idea of what actually would happen if the hippocampus was damaged, and there are people out there with damage to this part of the brain, and what happens to them is they end up getting stuck in time. Because they can't incorporate any new memories. It's like if you're in a drunken blackout or something like that, and you just stay in that, because you're not able to incorporate any new memories. And so if you have serious enough damage to the hippocampus at the age of 20, for instance, then a person in their 60s or 70s can look in the mirror, not recognize themselves, because for them it's like everything stopped at the age of 20. They can remember everything that happened before the injury. They can't remember anything that happened after the injury. So the reason why, and then here's, there you can see the limbic system right there, and so you can see how that's in the center of the brain. So this would be sort of the next level up after the midbrain, and people sometimes call this the reptilian brain. This is, you know, where your impulses come from, you know, things like anger and fear, and also the joy and that feeling of euphoria that you get comes from the limbic system. This is the real impulsive part of the brain. I'm going to show you something else here, as long as this thing is working. But you can see here the amygdala right here, and you can see the hippocampus. What you notice about those two areas of the brain is that they are right next to each other. Okay, they're connected, and they're very, very highly interconnected to each other. So what that means is when the amygdala is stimulated, or when it's turned off really strongly, then the hippocampus gets stimulated in a strong way too. And let's see if I can give you another view of it here. Let's see. I don't know, there must be something wrong with a connection or something. It's standing here before, I wasn't having a problem. Okay, I don't know, maybe I'll try to reboot this a little bit later and show you guys it, this all together. Yeah, typical is that, you know, we tried it out before this and it was working just fine, and now we're having problems.
When you rebooted it, did you just come right back to what you needed, or?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. Let me see if I'm going to try to put it sort of together, so I'm not, you know, turning it on and turning it off, because then we'll run out of time here. Okay, so I'll try to come back to that. You know, sorry that that's not working as well as I'd like it to. All right, so this is basically saying what I was talking about before. And also there's a neurotransmitter called glutamate as well that is also very important in memory too. That is in the pathway between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. So, you know, when your limbic system is stimulated, it's telling your brain this is important. This is a really important thing. You need to remember this. And that linkage that you have between the hippocampus and the amygdala, if we just look at this, okay, then we have a better understanding of that. Because you look at this and then you think, okay, well, you know, what are your memories from this day? Do you have very vivid memories? Do you remember things, you know, like they happened yesterday? And most people are going to say yes. And people noticed this before, after President John F. Kennedy was shot. That was the first time I think people really noticed this phenomenon, that people really had very vivid memories years later and even decades later. So this illustrates how when something is attached to a very strong emotional content, we tend to remember that very well, and we remember it without even trying. Okay, we don't really have to make any effort to remember it or anything like that. As opposed to you're trying to remember to pay a bill, or you're studying for a test for a master's or something like that, and you're making an effort, and yet you don't remember that as well.